Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar on the impunity and silence towards Israeli occupation crimes against the Palestinian people. We are joined by a number of speakers who will be talking about the issue from different perspectives. I'd like to thank all the speakers today for their time. We are honored to have them with us for this webinar. So just to give a bit of a context for today's webinar, on the 15th of May this week, Palestinians commemorated the 75th anniversary of Al-Nakba. Palestinians understand and experience Al-Nakba as an ongoing structure of colonial oppression and subjugation. Israel's regime and policies of occupation and apartheid affect all aspects of life for Palestinians, whether living inside Palestine or outside. For those who live inside, the daily realities of colonial violence, restrictions on movement, siege, and apartheid have come to define Palestinians' life there since Al-Nakba. Just last week, Israel attacked the besieged Gaza Strip, killing 33 people, including 6 children and 3 women. As you know, Gaza already suffers from the devastating consequences of the Israeli-Egyptian imposed siege, which has been ongoing for over 15 years. Gaza's economic and health infrastructure is in a dire condition, and the last attack only made those realities for people in Gaza worse. The 75 years of oppression and apartheid are continuous because of the complicity of the West and the absence of any kind of accountability for the many and countless atrocities Israel commits against Palestinians. Our speakers this evening will discuss potential strategies for bringing justice to Palestinians and putting an end to the impunity policy that Israeli leaders enjoy. We thank our speakers again, and we're very much looking forward to hearing their comments and interventions. Just a quick note that each speaker will have 7 to 10 minutes for their comments, and a discussion will follow after if time allows. And also I want to note that one of our speakers, Mr. Mark Seddon, couldn't join us in person, but we did an interview with him earlier, which we will stream during the webinar. So thank you again for our speakers, and we're looking forward to hearing your comments. Just for the sake of time, we will begin with our first speaker for this evening, Katie Fallon, who's an advocacy manager at Campaign Against Arms Trade. Katie, thank you so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Lovely, thank you, Rebecca. Hi everyone, my name is Katie Fallon. I'm advocacy manager at Campaign Against Arms Trade, so we're also known as CAT. I just want to thank the Arab Organization for Human Rights for inviting us to speak and for bringing us all together today. So in case you haven't heard of us before, Campaign Against Arms Trade is a UK-based organisation working to end the international arms trade. Our priorities are to stop the export of arms where they might either exacerbate conflict or support an oppressive regime. So very relevant in the case of Israel. Firstly, I just want to express my solidarity and my love to the Palestinian people. The latest round of bombardments last week and the suffering, loss and displacement, it's very difficult to think about it, let alone even experience it. And the strength that is shown by Palestinian people, I think, remains a source of inspiration for me and for all of us at CAT, and is a call to action for us to demand that our governments take action. So Israel is using military force to maintain a blockade of Gaza and further its occupation of the West Bank that are illegal under international law. In enforcing this occupation, it's consistently used disproportionate force, targeted civilians, used weapons that fail to distinguish between civilians and combatants, and furthermore engaged in collective punishment of civilian populations. The Israeli military is one of the most powerful in the world. Its Iron Dome defense system has a success rate of 90% when it comes to intercepting rockets, and it's backed by an advanced and increasingly high-tech arms industry. Israel is also a major arms importer, with most of its imports coming from the US. So 79% of its imports of arms were from the US in 2022. The UK government, however, is one of many that arms and supports the Israeli military. So since 2015, so that's since the current government that we have here in the UK has licensed at least 474 million worth of arms to Israel. And this does not include weapons that are licensed under the opaque open licensing system. And that system allows unlimited transfer of weapons mentioned on the license with no reporting requirement. So 474 million might seem like a lot, but it's actually far, the real total would be much higher if we were able to see what's been transferred on the open licenses. So at the very least, this includes 183 million of licenses for military technology, 122 million of licenses for aircrafts, helicopters and drones, and 24 million for grenades, bombs and missiles. And then we have a further 4 million for armored vehicles. And then we have also licenses for ammunition and for small arms. So it's kind of the full range of military weaponry. So these are the arms exports that we can track and we have available as a resource on our website. However, there's also UK made components, for instance, for the F-35 combat aircraft. So these are supplied by the US, but 10 to 15% of every jet sold has been made in the UK. And at the moment, we can't track that under these licenses. So at present, Israel has 36 of these aircraft and they're due to receive another 14 in the coming years. And the Israeli Defense Forces have confirmed that these have been used in bombardments against Gaza. So far, the UK has been very vague when it comes to answering questions in relation to the use of UK-made arms on the Palestinian people. A review of the government found that 12 licenses for arms were likely to have been used in the 2014 bombardment of Gaza, where more than 2,000 Palestinians were killed. Likewise, in 2010, the Foreign Secretary at the time said that UK-made arms had almost certainly been used in the 2009 bombing campaign. And this has been an ongoing issue for decades at this point. So CAT has repeatedly called on the UK government to suspend arms exports to Israel and for an investigation to see if there is a risk that these weapons could be used in the commission of serious violations of international humanitarian law. So that call for an investigation specifically refers to UK arms export regulations. So there are regulations in place that are supposed to prevent exports in these types of situations. I'll just give you some examples of the kinds of things that are supposed to prevent a license being granted. For instance, the government should not grant a license if it determines there's a clear risk that the items might be used to commit internal repression. They are also not to be exported if there's a serious risk that they'll be used in the facilitation or violation of international humanitarian law. Furthermore, they are supposed to take into account whether the recipient of the arms has in the past or looks likely in the future to have threatened to pursue by means of force a claim against the territory of another country. So I think it's very clear that all of these apply in the case of Israel's military campaign and occupation against Palestine and the Palestinian people. One of the reasons why these rules are basically being circumvented is because of the UK military, economic and political relationship with Israel. So there's been a close relationship for a long time, and this has been more formalized in 2021. Britain and Israel signed a 10-year trade and defense pact. And to kind of quote the government press release at the time, it aims to transform the relationship between the two countries into an even closer partnership by formally agreeing a new strategic plan for the next decade. And this is going to cover cyber, tech, trade, and defense. So that's, I guess, one means by which arms exports can continue to be transferred, even though there's regulation in UK law that should prevent this. Additionally, the UK also imports military technology and arms from Israel, who itself is a big producer of arms. Much of this technology is marketed as battle proven, which is a disgusting euphemism for having said that it's been used on Palestinians. This also includes drones, which have been provided to the UK Ministry of Defence through Elbit Systems and Thales UK. and that contract was for 800 million. These drones have also been used in the UK's border security as part of the government's campaign to demonise refugees crossing the Channel. And even for arms where that may be components rather than the full thing itself, like the full, fighter jet or a bomb, all of the same export control regulations should apply. So just because it's a component in a fighter jet doesn't mean there's any more leniency. However, in practice, the government managed to get around this. So yeah, I'd just like to finish by re-emphasising that CAT has repeatedly called for a two-way embargo and for the UK to end both arms sales and military support for the Israeli forces, which includes training and military alliances, and for an investigation into the likelihood of UK arms being used on Palestine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. That was very informative. I just have one question about the campaigns now by pro-Palestinian groups like Palestine Action, if you've heard of what they're doing now in terms of shutting down Al-Bayt. Do you feel like these are effective strategies to maybe prevent the UK government from selling arms to Israel, or maybe prevent the amount of weapons that go to the Israeli state and Israeli army?
I think that they are an effective way of showing the severity and the importance of the crisis that's happening at the moment. So I suppose while the resistance to the occupation gathers force, not just in the occupied territories, but elsewhere, like in the UK, we see the government basically ratcheting up its alliance with Israel and kind of like digging deeper. So it's very difficult to get the government to stop without having done an investigation that proves that the regulations have been violated. However, those campaigns have managed to shut down an Elbit factory. They have drawn a huge amount of attention and increased the public awareness, and all of that goes to building accountability. So in that sense, yes, they've been like a really important action on the landscape here in the UK.
Thank you so much, Katie. Yeah, that was very informative. We'll go to our second speaker for this evening, Tariq Khalil, who's an education coordinator at American Muslims Palestine. Mr. Tariq, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Arab Organization of Human Rights for having me. And it's such a pleasure to join these wonderful panelists to discuss a lot of these various issues. And thank you, Katie. That was very informative. I learned a lot from what you presented. My name is Tariq Khalil, and I am the education coordinator with American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, and a board member of its Chicago chapter. American Muslims for Palestine works to basically educate, organize. So the Palestinian people worldwide are commemorating now 75 years of a Nakba, which you highlighted, Ruba, thank you so much, or catastrophe. And it's important to understand and properly conceptualize the Nakba, which was not a singular event or humanitarian experience, but rather represents the shattering of the Palestinian collective and led to the dispersal, dispossession, disintegration, ethnic cleansing, fragmentation, statelessness, homelessness, denationalization, subjugation, and the continuous oppression of the Palestinian people. So it is an ongoing project. But it also led to the consolidation of a shared national consciousness, a consciousness that is rooted in resilience, in resistance, and steadfastness, and a collective struggle for justice and liberation. That's why the Palestinian struggle has gained a lot of traction over the years, even with the pitfalls that came with various frameworks in the last 20, 30 years. So here we are, 75 years since 1948. In the United States, it is no longer anathema to describe Israel as an apartheid regime. In fact, polls show that the younger generation, American polls, show that the younger generation, or what are called Gen Zs, have already crossed the threshold into being more sympathetic to Palestinians, Gen Zs and millennials. And a lot of, some of that has to do with the human rights reports that have come out vis-a-vis apartheid. So these various human rights organizations joined what Palestinians always understood and wrote extensively about, and that is that Israel is an apartheid regime. The mainstreaming of the apartheid label was assisted by, for example, the B'Tselem position paper, which is the Israeli human rights organization on apartheid, titled "A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid." Human Rights Watch put out a detailed analysis, one of the most esteemed human rights organizations, describing a reality of apartheid and persecution. And the title of its report is "A Threshold Crossed," and I'll get to that in a minute, essentially implying that Israel over the years turned into an apartheid regime. And the most comprehensive of the reports came from Amnesty International, where in its title, apartheid was described as a cruel system of domination and a crime against humanity. These human rights reports are a great step forward and essential reading because they flesh out the reality on the ground and how we can move the narrative forward on the question of apartheid and pressure the powers that be on dismantling the system of domination and control. However, it is of utmost significance that the point of departure for an apartheid analysis stems not from the notion that Israeli policy over the years turned the state apparatus into a system of apartheid, as these human rights reports do, but that Israel's foundational ideology paved the way for the creation of an apartheid system. So this point of departure is the essence of the Palestinian intellectual tradition. And it is the point of departure that these human rights reports on apartheid completely missed, or I would think feared to even tread. So Israel's foundational ideology is Zionism, which is a form of nationalism that is predicated on European conquering ideology and necessarily infused with a settler colonial project. Apartheid is the natural outgrowth of Zionism. It is impossible intellectually, philosophically, historically, linguistically to divorce Israel's founding from its foundational ideology. Therefore, the proper characterization is not that Israel over the years since 1948 turned into an apartheid regime, but that Israel was founded as an apartheid regime. The various elements of the definition of apartheid, as defined in the 1973 Apartheid Convention or the 1998 Rome Statute, racial domination, inhuman or inhumane acts in the context of systematic oppression. These elements are part and parcel of Zionism. They're not part and parcel of decades that eventually led to policies that consume those elements. These elements are inherent in the concept of Zionism from its ideological foundations up until its eventual takeover of Palestine in 1948. So it's important that we understand apartheid as an inevitable, unavoidable outcome of Zionist settler colonialism. This is the proper conceptualization of apartheid. These reports are essential in that they provide a lot of data, a lot of information, and these human rights organizations have a stature in the international community, and they have a respect factor that can lead to movements becoming stronger and can lead to policy changes from within, especially here in the United States, the number one ally for Israel, providing $3.8 billion in aid each year. So otherizing the indigenous population and relegating them to second-class citizenship status or as occupied subjects did not begin in 1967. That's usually the departure point of analysis when we talk about Israel-Palestine. But in 1948, and even before in many ways, actually, Israel's occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza in 1967, and imposing a brutal military regime in those areas is an intensification and expansion of an already existing regime. And that's how we have to properly conceptualize apartheid. I want to get to the question of accountability. So while international law does not provide perfect justice, it's the mechanism we have in place to provide some modicum of accountability. The International Criminal Court is such an institution. The ICC's founding treaty, which I just mentioned earlier, the Rome Statute, which also defines apartheid, was put into force in 2002. In January of 2009, Palestine as a state declared its acceptance of the ICC's jurisdiction without being a state party. The matter was eventually closed in 2012 because the ICC prosecutor at the time announced uncertainties regarding Palestinian statehood under public international law. But later on, in April 2012, Palestine's status was upgraded from observer entity to non-member observer state. And since the beginning of 2014, Palestine acceded to 36 multilateral treaties. And the important practical consequence of each of these extensions, including that of the Rome Statute, is that Palestine as a state for ICC jurisdictional purposes, now Palestine is allowed to act like a state within those treaties. And as such, in 2015, Palestine accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC over Israeli crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territories since 2014. And in December of 2019, after the prosecutor's nearly 5-year preliminary examination, it was determined that the statutory criteria under the Rome Statute for the opening of an investigation had been met. And just recently in 2021, the ICC decided that the court's territorial jurisdiction does extend to the occupied territories, namely Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. This means that the ICC prosecutor can begin investigating Israel for war crimes and crimes against humanity. In the context of Palestine, crimes are ongoing. So it's important for us to remember that the ICC has jurisdiction for crimes already committed and crimes that are being committed as we speak today, and future crimes, which are inevitable. The Office of the Prosecutor continues to receive evidence of crimes as the investigation unfolds. So for example, the International Federation of Human Rights and its member organization in Israel, Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, presented a joint communication to the Office of the Prosecutor denouncing alleged crimes committed by the Israeli Security Agency, ISA, against Palestinian detainees, and to include within the scope of the investigation the crimes of torture, inhuman treatment, unlawful deportation, and violations of the right to fair trial committed by the ISA. In fact, Amnesty International, in its report on apartheid, called on the United Nations Security Council to refer the entire situation to the ICC, to include all of historic Palestine, not just the occupied Palestinian territories, but all of historic Palestine, meaning from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Who knows how long of a process this will be before we actually see real material justice, but we are moving in the right direction. And we can use this movement toward accountability in our daily activism. We absolutely can't just sit and wait for the ICC to impose justice. We must work collectively to achieve justice, freedom, and liberation for the Palestinians from the ground up through grassroots movements, solidarity movements, transnational and intersectional movements. And that is why, for example, BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, the movement that brought about the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa, is a tactic that has gained much traction over the years. It employs the logic of pressure, not negotiations, but pressure, and demands the bare minimum guaranteed under international law. The bare minimum, it's a minimalist demand, not a maximalist demand. But our media in the United States describes BDS as anti-Semitic, but such labeling is not having the same traction it once had. The American people are slowly but surely realizing that Israel is the colonizer and the Palestinians are the colonized, that Israel is the oppressor and the Palestinians are the oppressed. They're beginning to see that Zionist demands are the maximalist extremist demands, and BDS are the minimalist mainstream demands. And poll data shows that the more Americans learn about Israel, the less they like it. So our job is to teach so people can learn, and they will naturally oppose oppression and in fact side with the oppressed. And that's the position that we're in now, and that's the traction that we're gaining now. And I thank you for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tariq. That was very insightful. And I think you're right. I think there's a shift in public opinion, whether it's in the United States or States or in here. And hopefully this will lead to changes in the political decisions these countries make and their position towards Israel. Thank you again, Tariq, and hopefully we'll come back at the end of the session with more questions and discussions. Thank you. We will now move to our next speaker, Zoe Lafferty, Director of Artists on the Front Line. Zoe, thank you so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I hope you can see me all right. For a strange reason, we're having sunlight in Britain, so hopefully you can see me. Thank you so much for having us here, and thank you both to the previous speakers. That was super, super interesting. So thank you. As mentioned, I'm a British writer, director in theatre, virtual reality, audio. I founded Artists on the Front Line, and I think more importantly for what we're probably discussing today, I'm an associate director of the Freedom Theatre in Jenin refugee camp in Palestine for the last 13 years. So I will speak briefly about how culture can tackle the international silence when it comes to Israeli occupation and war crimes and apartheid, and more specifically, a project called The Revolution's Promise that aims to build international solidarity through the collective sharing of stories. Firstly, I imagine lots of you maybe already know, but just to touch a little bit on the Freedom Theatre, its history and mission. It started after the Second Intifada, after the Israeli siege and invasion and bulldozing of Jenin refugee camp. And after at least 52 Palestinians were murdered in Jenin camp, many were injured, large proportion of the population were imprisoned. However, despite Israel's violence, clear human rights violations, internationally, and particularly in the media, Palestinians were the ones who were being labeled as terrorists. So in 2006, Zachary Zubeidi, one of the leaders of Alexa Marta Brigade, and actor and director Giuliano Meir-Kamis, decided to create the Freedom Theatre. Their mission was to equip young people with the artistic tools to express the reality of what was happening inside the camp to the outside world, and try and shift the narrative and shift this perspective. The Freedom Theatre created a brand of cultural resistance that stands up for human rights, justice, equality, whilst being careful not to denounce other tactics like armed resistance. And culture put Jenin camp on the map for creative reasons, and helps to shatter the international ignorance of the lived experience of the camp. And the theatre has had local and international success, and productions have toured worldwide. And I suppose I've seen firsthand how this can break racist and Islamophobic stereotypes, reclaim the Palestinian narrative, and build international solidarity. Arts has proved an incredibly important tactic, but challenging Israel's carefully created framing of its history and current actions has therefore meant there has been a very aggressive retaliation at the Freedom Theatre. In 2011, Giuliano Meir-Kamis, co-founder and artistic director, was murdered, and since then Israeli raids on the theatre, repeated imprisonment of staff has been really quite relentless. And most recently, the Bilal Asadi, the chair of the board, was arrested, and he's been in prison since September 2022. So many months. So I suppose this reality is what prompted myself, Artists on the Front Line, and the Freedom Theatre to work together and document the many forms of artistic censorship taking place that suppress Palestinian narratives from reaching international audiences, and helps Israeli war crimes continue with impunity. So across 2 years, we interviewed artists in the West Bank, Gaza, and 48, piecing together this strategy of silencing individuals. Our research started in the present day, but I think it's important to mention as a British person that our research took us as far back as the British Mandate, to Noor Ibrahim, poet, singer and fighter, as I'm sure many of you know, and wrote songs, collection in 1936, became so popular it was banned by the British, and a year later he was imprisoned after the spread of his chant Planet Mr. Dill, that mocked occupying armies, the British Army's commander-in-chief. And then in 1938, at 25 years old, the British shot and killed him. I think interestingly, like Ibrahim wrote in his diary about new laws that were being put in place that imprisoned scholars en masse using fabricated charges. And I suppose to a certain extent, it's that legal system which negates human rights and targets those who speak out, which has been, maintained, developed by Israel until this day, and which is why, of course, many Palestinians, including artists, can be held in prison without charge or trial. We also were very much investigating what's happening in the present, and current day testimonies, and artists we spoke to included poet Doreen Tator, who was in prison for writing the poem "Resist My People, Resist Them," and posting that poem on Facebook. Ali Abu Yassin from the Al-Mashal Cultural Center in Gaza that was totally obliterated by a bomb. Photographer Mohammed Al-Azhar, who was shot in the head while taking images, and many, many other artists who have been targeted in multiple different ways. So I suppose, we are a theatre, so what we did next is put these narratives together and created this script called The Revolution's Promise, with the plan to make a new theatre production. But I suppose in keeping with the theme of what we were making, borders, checkpoints, walls, visas, and travel bans are another very intense form of censorship, which has really sort of magnified for multiple reasons, including pandemics, including governments like Britain making these processes really tricky for artists to travel, and then of course all of the different borders and getting out West Bank, Gaza, etc. We decided in the end that rather than trying to make a traditional production with this script, and then sort of try and attempt to tour it through all these obstacles, we would create a model of global solidarity that encourages people worldwide to share and perform these stories within their own communities. This alternative model of storytelling and theatre has engaged those internationally to use their power, resources, and networks to spread the word, whilst still centering Palestinian voices and opinions and experiences, and putting teams internationally in contact with artists to develop what they want to do and that work. Whilst the project has seen full-scale productions by professional artists internationally, it's also a model of storytelling that does not require any acting skill. And we've developed formats that can be used depending on needs. So there's big long script of an hour if you want to really go for it on stage, a shorter version of 30 minutes, the individual monologues that you can read in any moment you want. We've created like a reading group format that has been used in schools by teachers and university professors, discussion group formats for unions, activist groups, and then more recently we've created a virtual reality film so that anyone in the world who has a headset can put that on and then be immersed in performances happening in Palestine, and the original artists are telling their stories directly in that, which is both hopefully powerful in terms of the political storytelling, but also like very, very beautiful, because you go to all these amazing locations in Palestine and you feel like you're sitting in them as much as possible. With all of this, there's educational materials to support anyone to join the project. So just really trying to find like absolutely any way and means to make this storytelling and these testimonies accessible for people to use in the environments that they're in. So I'd say, like, whilst there is undeniably a silence from Western governments and in mainstream spaces and media about the situation in Palestine, there's also, as we all know, these incredible solidarity networks across the world, and run by everyone and anyone from all backgrounds, cultures, experiences, languages. And I suppose, you know, often we find at the Freedom Theatre, they're asking, what can we do? And this gets really heightened in certain moments, and asking, like, what can we do? How can we collaborate? So I suppose by creating a format of storytelling that can be used by these networks as a tool, we've experienced an increase in deeper, meaningful solidarity and allyship and exchange. And this form of mobilizing has created a ripple effect that's allowed us to work with people on stages, classrooms, activist meetings, a field at some point, who pass on these first-hand testimonies in ways that they feel will engage their own communities. And this has meant we've managed to reach many places and audiences that maybe might not have been possible, you know, whether that's about access, energy, resources, time, and communicate with you know, a much broader group of people in a way. And so I suppose I urge people internationally, in whatever sector you work in, from campaigning, human rights, academia, you know, to collaborate with artists and Palestinian artists when speaking about Palestine, because I think it's tapping into those, like, key ways of storytelling. And of course, this sits within the skill set of artists. And of course, you know, not to end on a pitch, but I also invite anyone here who's interested to join the Revolution's Promise and share those stories. And I will, if I can, drop the link in the chat. So yeah, that's it from me. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and thank you so much for the amazing work that you're doing.
Hopefully you got that link.
Hopefully everyone can maybe take part in that. It's very important, especially that Palestinian culture, as the Palestinian body and the Palestinian. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Maybe Zoe, you have an issue because I'm not muted. But thank you so much for the amazing work that you're doing. And as I said, the Palestinian culture is, of course, as the Palestinian body and the Palestinian land is a target for Israel, and they want to obliterate the Palestinian culture. So initiatives like these and building networks of global solidarity, I think, is a very effective way of keeping the Palestinian culture alive. So thank you again, Zoe. And I'd like just to mention that the link was shared among some Zionist groups. So what happened earlier was, of course, part of their attempt to, like, destroy and sabotage the event and the webinar. And I think they do that with many Palestinian events. So sorry about that again. And now we have the recording from the interview that we did earlier with Mr. Mark Siddon, who's a director of the Center of UN Studies at Buckingham. We asked Mr. Mark about the complicity of Britain in the ongoing oppression of Palestinians and the impunity of Israeli leaders. So we will be streaming and showing his answers to our questions now.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Robert. I mean, I attended the Nakba event in London on Friday, which was organised by the Palestine Mission to the UK, and I also attended another event yesterday organised by the Balfour Project. And as you probably know, the United Nations, for the first time, commemorated the 75th anniversary of the Nakba. This is a result of a vote by the UN General Assembly. There is no question that people in this country are becoming rather more aware of the Nakba than they have been in the past. And there are a variety of reasons for that, I suspect. One is the fact that social media is so much more powerful now. People are getting their message across, but also, you know, in this country, people, they know about the Irish potato famine. They know about partition of India. But when it comes to the Nakba, it's the politicians don't tend to like to talk about it, and neither does the media. And I think what has happened is this is breaking through. And as you were saying, Robert, this is not just a commemoration of something that happened 75 years ago, but is clearly still happening today. And I know that because I also am involved in something called Palestine Deep Dive. And on Palestine Deep Dive, we regularly interview people in the occupied territories and right across Palestine, historic Palestine, and we hear. And so it was people should know that when you, to your direct question about children, that I think up to 500 children have been arrested and taken in by the Israeli authorities. They actually use law that they kept from the British Mandate. As you know all of this, but for people who don't know, it's an extraordinary revelation that here we have a government that is actually the Israeli government that is using emergency laws that the British put together during the mandate in Palestine. And which brings me to just one other point for your next question, really, which is that, you know, what has been quite apparent over the past few days is there's a realization that Britain has a historic responsibility for what happened 75 years ago and around the Balfour Declaration. And it's about high time that Britain should be standing up for the Palestinians and recognizing Palestine as a state. Many of the UN resolutions, I think since 1947, there have been perhaps 140 odd or more resolutions from the United Nations around Palestine. Many of these resolutions were actually put together by Britain. And in allowing this impunity, Britain is actually breaking some of these resolutions it helped put together at the United Nations that went through the Security Council. So it is absolutely appalling. And I don't think enough people understand this. They understand, for instance, that the United States sends some $3.5 billion each year to help Israel arm itself. And Britain also trades with Israel. It's just signed a new trading deal, as you know, which is highly controversial, does not even mention the occupation of Palestinian territories. This is illegal. I mean, actually, supplying arms to be used in illegally occupied territories is illegal. And I think what has really had a major effect on people is that they can see that there's a complete lack of consistency and there is hypocrisy when it comes to Britain and the United States and other countries in Europe arming those in Ukraine who are trying to throw out occupiers. But in Israel, they're arming the people who are occupying. And I think that more and more people are saying enough is enough. We want consistency, we want justice, we want this occupation to end, and we want to recognize a state of Palestine. And I think that's why it's going to be very important in the run-up to the general election in this country that enormous pressure is put on all of the political parties, especially those that have committed to do that. I was a member of the Labour Party for 45 years. I was a member of its National Executive Committee, and I was editor of a paper called Tribune, which is a Labour supporting paper. And there's no doubt in my mind that the overwhelming majority of Labour Party members are supportive of Palestine. And that is why there is this policy to recognize the state of Palestine. Unfortunately, there is a leadership currently that says that it's committed to doing just that, but I think by its actions has shown itself to be rather more regarding of Israel, and that translates. So we really do need to see a lot of pressure, I think. And by the way, I mean, you'll be aware of this, but a lot of Labour MPs are very concerned because they know that many of them, of course, support the Palestinian cause, but they also know that the votes in their constituencies often depend on this issue. So if there's any backtracking by the Labour Party on recognition of the state of Palestine, that could have a major impact on the election. I think it is down to the when it comes to this. I mean, there's in the Western press now, Western media, there's a lot of pressure being or a lot of comment about how China and Russia in particular, of course, is actually directly in breach of the UN Charter. But the fact that China, which is also a permanent member of the Security Council, has not been strongly speaking out against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is an issue. But what isn't an issue for the same media is why, as you were just saying, those same resolutions that go back an awful lot longer, because this is an occupation since 1967, over 50 years occupation, not 5 months, it's 50 years. I'm afraid that it does mean that the political establishment, especially in the United States and in Britain, and also in countries like Germany and France, have got double standards, and they regard their relationship with Israel as being more important than international law, it would seem. I mean, what else can explain it? Now, I just begin to wonder, because of course, Palestinians often look around the world and they wonder, where is the support amongst other Arab governments, not amongst peoples across the Middle East, but Arab governments. But increasingly, they may be thinking, well, if we simply cannot get the Americans or the British to support the resolutions, and especially for the British who wrote half of these resolutions, if they can't even support those, then really we have to look at elsewhere in the world for help and for other countries who are going to take this seriously and get involved in the shuttle diplomacy that is necessary to get serious peace negotiations underway. So I think that the United States in particular, in its absolutely it's blind support for Israel. Let's be honest with you. I mean, the Biden administration hasn't reversed the decision to move the embassy back from Jerusalem, out of Jerusalem. It hasn't taken out any sanctions, despite this being the most extreme right-wing government in Israel's history, and the expansion of the program, the demolition of schools, all of it is not doing anything. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Palestinians increasingly looked elsewhere for serious powers to come in and help try and force or encourage a settlement. Now, all I would like to say, I mean, thank you very, very much indeed. I think, given that we are in Britain, and given there is going to be a general election next year, I think an awful lot of thought needs to be, given by people as to how they can influence that election and bring about pressure on members of parliament. Because if there is, let's say, a Labour government with a small majority, or the Labour Party has to work with smaller parties, or a very small majority for the Conservatives, there is the opportunity. I think public opinion has shifted quite dramatically. And I'll just say one last thing. What we have seen, I think, is because of B'Tselem, because of the other NGOs, because of the UN, Amnesty, and all the rest of them, we now have as commonplace what you all already knew, but an acceptance that this is apartheid, and apartheid is having a big effect. People in this country were very much against apartheid in South Africa, and they will be just as much against apartheid as they become more and more aware of what's really happening in Palestine.
So that was Mr. Mark speaking to us earlier today. And we thank him again for his time and insightful comments. We will be now moving to our next speaker, Dr. Ramzi Baroud, who's a Palestinian American journalist and the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. Dr. Ramzi, we're very honored to have you here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for Ruba for hosting this, and the Arab Organization for Human Rights for organizing such important events. Since some of the issues I was planning to touch on have kind of been covered in quite an articulate way as well, I want to talk, the topic of today is impunity, and why Israel is constantly getting away with murder, literally with murder, and with no accountability whatsoever. And I agree with pretty much everything that Mark a good friend and an excellent journalist in his own right, has said, but I wonder sometimes that is this really about knowing or not knowing what is happening in Palestine? What is going on in Palestine has been going on for 75 years and more. In fact, commissions sent by various countries, from Britain, from from the United States, from the League of Nations, even prior to the establishment of the United Nations, among others, have all concluded that something horrific was happening in Palestine prior to the establishment of Israel. This was free and available knowledge to everybody. It's not like it was this well-kept secret. And now we are beginning to understand and realize that Israel has been committing war crimes in Palestine. So there is no element of newness to any of this. Palestine was admitted into the ICC 2009 because of the so-called Cast-Lead operation. How many people were killed in Cast-Lead? 2,370 something, right? And over 10,000 were wounded. And yet there was another war, 2012, a major war, 2014, another war, 2021, and of course there was 2019, and now again a few days ago, and so many mini wars in between, in addition to the fact that according to the United Nations itself, the year 2022 has been the most violent since the UN has been keeping counts of particular type of casualties in the West Bank, which is 2005, after the end of the Second Palestinian Intifada. So between 2005 to 2022, last year was the most violent, again, by the admission of the United Nations in the kind of reports that are made available to all UN members, whether in the Security Council or in the General Assembly. Everybody knows what is happening in Palestine. Maybe ordinary people have been hoodwinked for such a long time because of, we know, the power of Zionist media and all of that, but that is changing, and it's changing rapidly, which is good news for Palestinians. And that is helping us create kind of a counter infrastructure based on civil society organizations, mosques, churches, synagogues, and all sorts of organizations that are operating outside of governmental and political institutions. But in my mind, it's really not the lack of knowledge that is prohibiting Palestinians from receiving, finally, that international support that they deserve. I don't know if you guys watched Mahmoud Abbas's speech before the security, or rather the United Nations, on the Nakba Day 3 days ago. It really was quite a jumble of words, and that really a speech should have never been given, considering the fact that this is the first time in the history of the organization that Nakba Day is commemorated by an international institution to this level, which is a great in terms of the power of that event, and how it's once more reasserting itself on the consciousness of the world. And this is the credits to go, of course, to the Palestinian people, to the resistance, but also to the massive global solidarity that has been at work every single day for so many years. But the rest of the world, they know. Governments understand what is happening in Palestine. And some of us who have been working on this for literally decades, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I did report from the United Nations, and I did report from the Security Council, and I've interviewed various ambassadors of various countries from the global south to the global north. There is knowledge. It's just the lack of the political will because of the hegemony that the Americans have over the decisions of the United Nations. I know that in a few days there's going to be massive debate at the UN regarding the need to reform it. And I know that China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and other countries, mostly the BRICS nations, but other nations as well, including Arab nations, are pushing for reform, reformatting the structure of the UN so it reflects in a more democratic way the will of the international community. And I think until that happens, the United States will continue not only to control the political directions and the political nature of or will of the United Nations, but rather all the other institutions that are affiliated with it. And here's an example. We all remember when Ariel Sharon was being, there was the possibility of trying him in Belgium over war crimes committed during the Sabra and Shatila massacre and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And of course, there were legal basis for that because some of the victims, the survivors rather, of Sabra and Shatila were Belgian citizens, and because Belgium allows its citizens to file for war crimes against, if these were crimes committed against them anywhere in the world, Ariel Sharon naturally was the first to face that possibility. And we know all what happened when the United States began exerting pressure on Belgium, threats at times, kind of carrot and stick sort of thing, as if Belgium is just a client regime for Washington. And not only did they actually manage to force Belgium to drop the case, they forced Belgium to restructure its entire legal apparatus so that this does not happen again. The same thing happens with the Palestinians, even though Washington is not a member of the ICC. Washington has taken upon itself to advocate for Israel to prevent the ICC from trying Israeli war criminals before the International Criminal Court. How did they do that if they are not members of the ICC? They did it through what they call friends of the courts. I think there are about 8 of them, or I can't remember the exact number, but I know that Germany and Australia were some of these countries that advocated for Israel to drop the case, constantly finding ways. Palestine is not a full member of the UN. Palestine is not, eligible for this sort of trial because of this and that. So another, pretense. Well, because also Israel is capable of trying its own citizens, and Israel is a democratic state, and all of this. This is Germany. World War II, Holocaust, Nazi past is instead of finding it morally compelling to actually say never again against anybody, actually stood against Palestinians and continues to fight at the ICC tooth and nail to prevent the Palestinians from advancing the case. And even though technically there is a case that is open, we doubt that anything is going to happen anytime soon. And I'm not being a pessimist. We are in touch with the lawyers who are advocating for Palestine at the ICC, and they told us that the budget for the ICC trials just came out. And the budget for this year and next year allocated to Palestine and the investigation of Israeli war crimes in Palestine is the lowest, which indicates kind of wink, wink, they are not really planning to advance the case. But wait a minute, why advancing cases against the likes of Vladimir Putin, right, and issuing an arrest warrant for crimes supposedly committed on February 22nd? So within a year time, within a single year, there were deliberations, cases, files, lawyers, and the pre-trial chamber issuing an arrest warrant. When in the case of Palestine, 75 years, hundreds of massacres, a continuous military occupation, a continuous system of apartheid, violations of every possible war crimes related law at the UN, crimes against the humanity, even the crimes of genocide, of course, the crime of apartheid, crimes of aggression, crimes against peace, and the whole lot. yet we haven't even seen a trial that is moving in the right direction. And we are watching these crimes happening before our own eyes on TV 24/7. So the issue here in my mind, and I will try to cut it short because I think I've reached my 10 minutes. The issue in my mind is really not the lack of knowledge, is the lack of the political will because of the current legal infrastructure that is either controlled directly by the United States through the United Nations, through the use of veto power at the Security Council, or indirectly through the ICC and other organizations in which the US is not a member. So if we are to fight this, we have to keep that understanding in mind, that things will not magically happen. They will happen through a strategic process that is led by Palestinians and their friends. We need to go after countries like Germany and Australia. We need to hold them accountable. They cannot get away with obstructing justice to this extent when thousands of Palestinians continue to die as a result of Israeli war crimes in Gaza and in the rest of Palestine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramzi. That was very, very insightful, and you raised many, many important points. And you're absolutely right. It's not the lack of political knowledge, it's the lack of political will. And I think unless the hegemony of the US is broken, Palestinians don't really have many avenues to hold Israel accountable for the many atrocities they commit against Palestinians. Thank you so much again, Dr. Ramzi. That was really insightful. We will now be moving to our next speaker, Ahmed Abu Fool, international lawyer, legal research and advocacy officer at Al Haq organization. Thank you so much, Ahmed, for being with us today. And we're looking forward to hearing your comments, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruba, and thanks to the Arab Organization for the kind invitation and for organizing such important event. I find it really hard, honestly, to speak after the adequate presentations of the speakers. They've pretty much covered everything, but I will try to comment on a few points and maybe explain a bit the underlying regime under which all of these crimes are being committed and impunity is being ensured by Israel. First of all, on what Khalid said, I'd just like to emphasize that the description of the situation in Palestine, or the characterization of it as an apartheid, is not new. It didn't come with Human Rights Watch. It didn't come with Beit Salem. As a matter of fact, Palestinians like Faiz Said have been writing about this since the early 60s. The experience of Nakba has been described and always associated with the apartheid regime in South Africa. So I think that's something also Zoe alluded to. It's important to center Palestinian voices. It's important for us as Palestinians to reclaim the narrative. I have to say what I'm saying, I have to be clear. I'm really grateful also for our colleagues in civil society, whether in Israel or international organizations, who always emphasize that the Palestinians have been saying this for decades, and only now Israeli and international civil society have joined the call. So it's important also for us, the Palestinians, to recognize that we're not lacking any qualification or the ability of providing a legal analysis describing our own reality, and this position should be centered. I already shared the link of Al-Haq's apartheid report, which was entitled Israeli Apartheid, a Tool of Zionist Settler Colonialism, exactly what Khalid was saying. But it happens often that even in media, in political speeches, there's reference to these reports, but not to what the Palestinians have been saying. And this really reminded me of what Edward Said wrote in the 80s, a great article entitled Permission to Narrate. It feels like we needed permission to narrate our own struggle as Palestinians, and it's always more credible somehow if an Israeli says it or if an international organization says it. Of course, again, I reiterate that that's not the understanding within our colleagues in Israeli human rights organizations or international organizations. We work together. They recognize that Palestinians have been saying this for forever. So I just wanted to touch upon that, and I think Mark is absolutely right when he said that although these reports came recently, that's what you all know as Palestinians, exactly, because we lived under this apartheid regime. And I think an important thing to elaborate on is how this apartheid regime functions and how it guarantees the impunity. The apartheid regime is basically focused on the denial of the Palestinian people for their right to self-determination. And in order to do that, Israel has strategically fragmented the Palestinian people into at least 4 separate geographic, legal, political, and administrative domains as a tool to impose and maintain its apartheid regime. These 4 domains are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, who comprise almost 21% of the Israeli population and live as second-class citizens inside Israel, an apartheid regime that is being also imposed on them. The second category is Palestinians in Jerusalem, who live with a precarious residency status that can be revoked at any time, including because of allegations of a breach of allegiance. As preposterous as this may sound, and colonial occupying power want the occupied population, instead of resisting it, pledge allegiance to it. The third category is the Palestinians in the rest of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, who have been living under military rule, under military occupation for over 55 years. This is the longest occupation in modern history. And the fourth, and I think the most important perhaps category that underline the Palestinian experience is Palestinian refugees, who comprise over half of the Palestinian population, who are outside the Palestinian geography, scattered around the world and in neighboring countries, and internally displaced in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The Gaza Strip, for example, over 55 or 60% of the people in Gaza are refugees, are not originally from Gaza. And of course, all of those are denied their unalienable right to return. So the Israeli apartheid regime strategic fragmentation ensures that the Palestinian people can never meet, group, live together, or exercise any form of collective rights as a people, particularly their right to self-determination and permanent sovereignty. And this strategic fragmentation is further entrenched through the illegal blockade of the Gaza Strip, which, as the UN described, is an open-air prison. And I think, as understandably how some activists are describing it, it's a big concentration camp where Israel controls every aspect of Palestinian life, and even calculate the calorie intake that Palestinians need in the Gaza Strip to survive, with a policy described as the head right above the water, where you can breathe, but you can't swim, and you can die at the same time. So in addition to that, you have the annexation wall, the so-called apartheid wall, the Israeli permit regime, the checkpoints, physical barriers severely impacting freedom of movement of the Palestinians. And on top of that, you have a whole legal foundation of that apartheid regime. For example, in 2018, Israel enshrined apartheid in its basic law, the so-called the nation state of the Jewish people law, which states that the exercise of the right of self-determination is exclusive to the Jewish people in Israel. So through this entrenchment of settler colonialism and apartheid, Israel denies the Palestinians their permanent sovereignty, including over their natural resources, while of course ensuring unrestricted access to its population and the complicit cooperations in its crimes. So in order to maintain this regime, Israel has to employ some practices, and as a result has to commit crimes, because these let me just highlight one of the most important aspects of how Israel is maintaining its apartheid regime is the systematic impunity within the Israeli judicial system. Israel's legislations and military orders render the Israeli judiciary, including the Supreme Court, as enablers of its apartheid regime, which confer legitimacy on the regime's legal foundation facilitate the continued perpetuation of these policies and practices, and is designed to produce impunity and prevent Palestinians from effectively challenging the regime. And Israel does that through a wide range of repressive policies, including the widespread systematic use of mass arbitrary detention, excessive use of force, including its shoot to kill policy, torture, collective punishments. And I think each of these topics need a webinar to talk about. But all of these are aimed at oppressing and intimidating the Palestinians and subjugating them. So, for example, if I want to talk about torture, torture has been sanctioned by the Israeli High Court of Justice and has been since the beginning of Israeli occupation, including against detained Palestinian children, has been used and is becoming a standard operating procedure. Of course, collective punishment. If I want to talk about collective punishment, the inhumane practice of withholding Palestinian deceased bodies and not releasing them to their families to mourn them, the blockade of Gaza, also the campaign of intimidation, harassment, and delegitimization of human rights defenders and organizations advocating for Palestinian rights and calling for accountability, including through threats, targeting with notorious Pegasus spyware, travel bans, deportation, and punitive residential revocation, like what happened with our colleague Salah Hamouri from Damir, who is a citizen, a resident of East Jerusalem. He was deported to France. Of course, as you all well aware, in 2021, Israel's defense minister also criminalized 6 Palestinian organizations, including Al-Haq, the one I'm proudly associated with, because of our legitimate human rights work and because of our work exposing Israeli crimes, and in particular because of our cooperation with the ICC, notably since the ICC started its preliminary examination even before the investigation. Palestinian human rights organizations, including Al-Haq, have been submitting crucial information and evidence to the Office of the Prosecutor. One must not forget that the only access the international community have to the documentation, to the requisite documentation of these crimes, is through these Palestinian organizations that have been criminalized. Israel denies access to special rapporteurs of the United Nations, to commission of inquiries, to any form, any judicial body or any investigative team to enter the occupied Palestinian territories. So the targeting of these organizations represent, I think, in my view, a desperate move of an anxious apartheid regime that wants to conceal its crimes from the international community and failing to do so even with all the oppression and the restrictions. So these laws, policies, and practices are in nature designed to oppress the Palestinians and to affect who try to oppose and challenge Israel's apartheid regime. Therefore, Israel's apartheid regime, in my view, is premised on a promise of impunity to its soldiers to oppress the Palestinians and dehumanize them. Accountability for the apparent serious violations and alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity, I think, is the missing piece in the puzzle. There need to be accountability, including at the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction over the situation in Palestine. But most importantly, I think it has a statutory responsibility to investigate those responsible for the most serious crimes, including the crime against humanity of apartheid that I think is widely documented. And there is a growing consensus among the human rights movement as a whole that this situation is, in fact, that of apartheid. And I think until there is accountability, this apartheid regime, unfortunately, will continue. And I'd like to maybe end with a quote, something Benjamin Friends, an international advocate for justice, and he was one of the late living Nuremberg prosecutors. He actually passed away a few weeks ago, and he once said in Nuremberg who are persecuting Nazis. There can be no peace without justice, and no justice without law, and no meaningful law without a court to decide what is just and what is lawful under any given circumstances. End of quote. And we believe that court, in this case, when you talk about accountability, is the International Criminal Court. So there is, I think, no excuse for the International Criminal Court to delay issuing a arrest warrants anymore. There is need to expedite its investigation and start issuing arrest warrants and live up to its responsibilities as a court of last resort for Palestinian victims who crave justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmad, for your excellent analysis on the specific nature of Israeli apartheid regime and how it functions on the ground in Palestine. Thank you again. That was really insightful. We will now be moving to our last speaker, Shayna Lowe, Communication Advisor at the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you so much, Shayna, for being with us today, and please go ahead.
Great, thank you so much for hosting me, and thanks to the Arab Organization for Human Rights for bringing together these incredible speakers. I think we've had a lot of people talk about accountability mechanisms, and what I really want to focus on is what the failure of accountability is leading to here on the ground. So just to give a little bit of background about the Norwegian Refugee Council, we're an international humanitarian organization that works in contexts all around the world. Here in Palestine, we work to ensure that Palestinians affected by or threatened with displacement in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, have access to assistance and protection. Our operations, which are rooted in respect for human rights and the responsibility for all actors to uphold international humanitarian law, work to serve Palestinians who have been impacted by the occupation or the siege of Gaza. And we work to provide high quality humanitarian assistance for those who are underserved and most vulnerable, also challenging policies that bring about the violations of IHL. And we work to be a strong advocate and clear voice for the people that we serve. So like I mentioned, I really want to focus on what we're seeing on the ground here, just in terms of the widespread impunity from the internet and the way that the international community has really allowed, in particularly over a longer period of time, but particularly in the last year and a half, we've seen trends around violence in the occupied West Bank, and also demolitions, which are of course connected to settlement expansion, continue to grow. And so I really want to focus on how last year was a record-setting year in the West Bank. We saw that at least 152 Palestinians, including 36 children, were killed in the West Bank, which made it the deadliest year since the UN began recording casualties in 2005. Most of those were killed, shot and killed by Israeli forces with live ammunition. And really, in many of these cases, we're seeing that excessive use of force is being deployed, again, without any accountability, not from internal Israeli mechanisms, and of course not from the international community as well. We're seeing that this trend is really, because there's been lack of accountability, that this trend is really continuing into this year, and we're already at pace to surpass last year's figures. We've already, in the first 4 months of this year, the UN has documented 99 Palestinians, including 18 children, killed in the West Bank alone. That doesn't include the 33 that were killed in Gaza just last week. And again, we're seeing that failure to hold the Israeli government accountable, failure for the Israeli government to hold settlers accountable for their violence, is leading to this kind of situation on the ground that really is, at least since the Second Intifada, unprecedented. We saw last year that the UN reported that there was a record number of settler violence attacks, and the UN reported that there were 849 attacks that resulted in proper, and the thing about the UN documentation is that it underreports what's actually happening on the ground, because they're only reporting incidents that result in property damage or casualties. So they fail to really recognize the full scope of the problem and take into account incidents that just involve trespass or intimidation and harassment. The humanitarian organization Première Urgence Internationale, who NRC works very closely with, documents types of incidents that go beyond just property damage and casualties. And last year they documented over 1,570 attacks, which is an average of 4 attacks per day. And what's really alarming in terms of what they're seeing is that it's not just individual settlers, but we're seeing larger groups of settlers in coordination with Israeli forces. And in 3 years, they saw the number of incidents that involved Israeli forces jump from 10% to 20%. And what we're seeing is that the Israeli military and the settler movement are working together hand in hand, coordinating to ensure that these these attacks are happening and creating coercive environments that are forcing Palestinians to flee, of course, and to leave their homes, pushing Palestinians into urban centers and largely in Area A of the West Bank, and working to really pave the way for settlement expansion. And we're seeing now with far-right members of the Israeli government who have strong ties and have even been leaders within the settler movement, that this is really a spoken policy, whereas before it was an unspoken policy. It's now a spoken policy, and really we're seeing that the international community has allowed the far-right elements of the Israeli government to really control what is happening here in the West Bank. We're seeing also growth in demolitions. Of course, demolitions, which is something that NRC works very, very closely on. We run a legal aid program that works to provide Palestinians at risk of displacement with assistance to prevent their demolitions and resulting forcible transfer. And what we're seeing is that last year was the highest number of demolitions since 2016. What we're seeing also is even when the international community does speak out or does try to show up to support communities that are at risk, we're seeing that they're failing to prevent demolitions and resulting forcible transfer. I think the most recent example that I can think of is just last week. We saw a week ago Sunday, just the school in Jabhat Adib near Bethlehem get demolished by Israeli forces. This was mere days after the diplomatic community showed up at the school in order to demonstrate to the Israeli government that the school should be protected. And so what we're really seeing is that kind of the traditional mechanisms that used to at least prevent some forcible transfer are really failing now. And so it's time, I think, for the international community to step up. I think a number of the other speakers on this panel talked about different ways in which we can work to hold Israeli authorities accountable. One thing that was not mentioned is the upcoming advisory opinion that's going to be issued by the ICJ that will look at the legality of Israel's prolonged occupation. It's important that folks push their governments, if they're going to submit briefs to the court, that they work to ensure that those briefs are supportive of ensuring that Palestinian rights are protected and upheld. I think I will leave it there since we've been hearing a lot from other people about accountability measures, but thank you for inviting me to join this distinguished panel.
Thank you so much, Jaina. That was really insightful and informative. Thank you so much for being with us today. I think we're coming to an end for this webinar. We were joined today by an amazing panel of speakers, and we thank them again for their time and for very insightful interventions and comments. Thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you again soon in another webinar.